Hello everyone, okay then, welcome to this lesson. So in this particular lesson I'm going to go over what is meant by One Nation Conservatism from that work which you should have done, and then we'll have a little discussion about Thatcherism, and it may be in this video I may have to make a part 2 where we'll discuss some of the similarities between Thatcherism and One Nation Conservatism and also some of the differences between the two. Okay, so One Nation Conservatism then is this was dominated the Conservative Party really from certainly since the Second World War and probably since Disraeli in the 1860s. And as you should have got onto this table here, there are certain key features of One Nation Conservatism which you should be able to see fits into that stuff we did on the ideologies of left and right, especially of the right. So if you have a look through, we've got things like they believe very much in law and order. Okay, it fits into that general philosophy of those on the right. So you believe that human nature is flawed. Therefore, One Nation Conservatives believe in law and order, protecting the police, having like kind of a hard line against crime. So they tend to support tough prison sentences, those sorts of things. In terms of society, they believe that society has evolved slowly and organically, a bit like a plant. Therefore, you shouldn't make radical changes to society. You should just kind of allow it to kind of continue to grow organically and slowly. In terms of things like social policy, many of the One Nation Conservatives dislike diversity. They believe that if you try and bring in too many people from different cultures, that can upset society. It can bring about radical change with untold circumstances or consequences, that's a better word. And so therefore they tend to be resistant to high levels of immigration. They tend not to be entirely in favour of multiculturalism. They also dislike, have a fear, I suppose, of things like unconventional lifestyles, I suppose, so LGBTQ rights, for example. They tend to have a strong belief in things like, traditional family values, because families are quite stable, mummy, daddy, 2 kids, that type of stuff. And this fits into their ideas about tradition as well. So they like, things like how the countries are quite traditional, we should maintain, have some reverence for some of our institutions, things like Parliament and the monarchy. And vet other traditions which Britain has, and these are things which makes Britain Britain, and they should be preserved. Again, they very much support things like private property, so people should be able to own their own property, and property rights should be protected at all costs. Again, it's quite a strong belief of those on the political right. They tend not to like taxation, for example, on property. Property owners should be protected. Law and order is quite important for this as well, because people go looting and stuff. Then obviously that's going against people's private property. But they also believe, One Nation Conservatives, that those with wealth and money should actually help those who are not privileged in certain ways. But they'll prefer this to be done through the voluntary sector, so like through the work of charities and stuff. So if you've gained quite a lot of wealth in your life, you've had a quite successful job, you've got property and stuff, and you've got some spare cash, then they'd be quite encouraging of people. Note the word encouraging as opposed to making people perhaps donate some of that money to charities, etc., etc. And they seem to be very pragmatic as well. So like we keep on saying, the Conservatives traditionally are very pragmatic. One Nation Conservatism is again a fairly pragmatic kind of beliefs, accepting some things which the Labour governments have done which have been quite popular, some of which do fit into their philosophy, like the NHS, for example, because it benefits the poor and the rich, and it's kind of a community thing. And I suppose actually it's become a bit of a tradition in Britain, hasn't it, the National Health Service. So again, One Nation Conservatives are very kind of pragmatic. In terms of policies like Europe, again, many Conservatives who are One Nation today are probably those who mainly on the European Union, supported the European Union, supported Remain, for example. And again, this is partly because, taking us out of Europe is kind of creating a big change, with untold consequences, which they fear. Europe they see as being quite traditional, in terms of a lot of our economy is tied up with Europe. Britain's been involved with European affairs for quite a long time. So there is that kind of that established order, I suppose, with the European Union. In terms of state intervention, they're much more relaxed about the state intervening in the economy. So, for example, like with the National Health Service, they were quite supportive of some of the trade unions as well, or certainly weren't hostile to trade unions in the same way Thatcher was. During the 1960s, 50s and 70s, I put those decades on the wrong order, they were quite supportive when Labour had nationalised certain key industries like steel and rail. One Nation Conservatives, being quite pragmatic, didn't really alter them. They thought, well, they kind of work. They kind of go against some of our principles about free trade, but, if they work, why change it, basically? So that is kind of where One Nation Conservatism is. And again, you should have some nice stuff on this page here, on this table. You then had to watch the video from Andrew Marr on Mrs. Thatcher. And you probably gathered from here all the questions, and you should have gathered from this some key features of Thatcherism, which you then need to put onto this table. I didn't really mean to put the blob over her nose and mouth, okay, but anyway. So what I'd like to do is put on the key features of Thatcherism here. So I imagine you're going to say things like, it was more ideological. She supported a much smaller state and was quite active in privatising, selling off some of those national industries like steel and communications and airways, and allowing free competition to kind of take place in these areas. In terms of finance, again, she got rid of a lot of the regulations on finance. So, for example, up until when she came into power, it was actually quite difficult to get a mortgage for a house. You could only get a mortgage worth a certain percent of your wage. To get a credit card to go shopping and stuff, again, it was quite difficult to get a credit card. You had to prove that you earned a certain amount, etc., etc. For both of those sorts of financial things, you got rid of a lot of the regulations to make it much easier for companies to compete to try and sell your credit cards and, take less notice of your income compared to what you wanted to spend. And the same for mortgages. And in some ways, this led to a big boost of the economy. But in other ways, then obviously people do get into debt and things, don't they, as a consequence. Things like, she also did things like, she stood up to the trade unions, especially the miners, who were the big trade unions in the early 1980s, and she passed a number of laws against trade unions. In terms of private property, though, there's a link here with One Nation Conservatism. This support for private property. She sold off council houses to individuals to buy themselves. So in that regard, she was promoting private property, so people could afford to buy their council properties. And I suppose as well, making those mortgages easier for people to get, again, fits into this idea, doesn't it, of expanding private property. In other respects, the video does a little bit less on this, but things like, she was actually quite conservative with a small c in things like social policy. So Section 28 is something which she passed in government, which basically said that teachers couldn't basically talk about gay rights and stuff in case it promoted gay rights. She was always quite traditional in her view of the monarchy and the church, family values as well. These are all very traditional things of Thatcherism. And I suppose you could argue in some ways that she was very radical economically, but then on the social side, she was, she wasn't. And in fact, in the Andrew Marr video, it said she was a child of the 60s, the 1860s, meaning this kind of belief in these Victorian values. And in many respects, what she did actually went against some of her own values, because she thought that if you free people from these regulations, they've got money to spend, then they'll probably put it into savings. What she didn't really expect, I don't think, was people to actually go spending crazy and all these shopping centres would open, etc., etc. Okay, and then the final thing I want you to do is this table here. So from what we've just discussed about Thatcherism, what we discussed about One Nation Conservatism, what are the key differences between One Nation Conservatism and Thatcherism? So what is the One Nation Conservative view of the economy? What was Thatcher's view? One Nation Conservative view about state intervention. It just kind of link into the economy, to be fair. Thatcherism, taxation, welfare, Europe, and trade unions. And actually, just thinking about it, I should really put this on this table somewhere. Perhaps right at the bottom, what similarities are there between Thatcherism and One Nation Conservatism? So again, you might need to write at the bottom. I should really do an extra table or question somewhere. But have a think about the similarities. So I've already mentioned, for example, things like private property. Both of them kind of revere. Law and order is another one, which again, Thatcher was quite strong in law and order. Or there's police, for example, against those striking miners. So if you could do that for me, that would be grand. And then either when I see you next or over the weekend, we'll have a look about, is the modern Conservative Party today Thatcherite or not? But we'll come to that later on. So for now, if you get on with doing this, that would be great. And then we'll move on to this bit later about the current Conservative Party being Thatcherite or not. So that's where you need to be. So if you've got any questions or queries about that, then obviously do please let me know. But hopefully that should be relatively straightforward for you.